President Biden and Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu had their first call since Iran's retaliatory drone attack 2 weeks ago. The two leaders talked about a potential ceasefire deal to secure the release of hostages and increase humanitarian assistance into Gaza. Biden also repeated warnings against an Israeli invasion of Rafah. This comes as the U.S. weighs whether it should restrict aid to an Israeli military unit after determining it was one of 3 credibly implicated in gross human rights violations against Palestinians. That was prior to October 7th. In an undated letter obtained by NBC News, Secretary of State Antony Blinken wrote to Speaker Mike Johnson that it was still under review. The 2 other units will continue to receive military assistance despite those concerns because the U.S. says it was given assurances from the Israeli government. Joining us now is Democratic Congresswoman Katie Porter of California, who also sits on the Oversight Committee. Congresswoman, it's great to see you again. To my understanding, you are one of 2 members of Congress to receive an individual briefing from officials at the State Department about aid to these Israeli military units. However, Friday's news about the 3 Israeli groups or battalions, if you will, accused of human rights abuses contradicted what you were told in your briefing. Am I getting that right? Can you expand on this?
Absolutely. So I think to start at the very beginning for everyone watching, as a taxpayer, as an American, when we use our taxpayer dollars to give aid to any country, military aid, we do not want those weapons or that training being provided to military units that engage in gross violations of human rights. We're talking about really terrible things: murder, rape, kidnapping. And for most other countries, there's a pretty straightforward process. Before the aid's given, the State Department vets the individual military unit, say the battalion, and if there's any evidence, credible evidence of a gross violation of human rights, the aid does not go. But Israel has a different process, and that's what I requested and received the State Department briefing on. But what we found out this week, after I heard all about that process and got assurances that it was working, is that in fact it's not working. The State Department employees sent up evidence of gross violations of human rights that Israel has not remediated, has not held people accountable for. And where have those memos been? Sitting with the Secretary of State. And so this raises very, very real questions about whether the Leahy law designed to prevent our taxpayer dollars from being used wrongfully by militaries is working as intended.
I don't want to ask you to speak on the State Department, but do you have any reason why they are not acting on it? I mean, what is your understanding as to why these memos, as you mentioned, are just sitting there with these accusations or evidence of accusations or gross human rights violations and not being acted on?
That is exactly the right question that Congress now needs to be asking. We need to be asking, what happened here? We already had a lot of concerns. I had many concerns about this special process for Israel. It's called the Israel Leahy Vetting Forum. Leahy is the name of the law that's supposed to stop aid from flowing to these units that have engaged in human rights violations. But what we were told is, after all of this extended process, after Israel's given a chance to address the violations, to hold people accountable, when it goes up to the Secretary with a recommendation from all of these different departments at the State Department, then aid must stop. The law is clear here. What is not clear is what has happened at the State Department and who, if anyone, besides Secretary Blinken, may be implicated in this decision.
Is there a role for Congress to play here? And I know the short answer to that is yes, but I guess the broader question is, are your colleagues in line with what you've outlined? Do you find that you have support for them to actually do their job and exercise oversight over the implication of violating the Leahy law?
Well, this process, particularly with regard to Israel and a handful of other countries, has been pretty shrouded with mystery. It's new. It started only a few years ago. And again, Israel and a handful of other countries, about a dozen other countries, have this different, separate process. That is not well known by my colleagues in Congress. It was something that we investigated when we had a hearing about human rights violations, and I questioned the witnesses about it, and then had this briefing. So I think there's a lot of work that I need to be doing, along with colleagues who've worked on this issue, like Senator Chris Von Hollen, to educate Congress members that the process that we are told is working is in fact not working. And that because we've set up a special process for Israel, we have a duty to investigate whether that special process is working. And here it appears it may not be.
If it is not, what do you think should happen?
Well, under the Leahy laws, the remedy here is if a military unit, it could be at the individual level, say a commander, it could be at the battalion or unit level. We talk about military units. What's supposed to happen under the Leahy law, the law is very clear on this, is if a gross violation of human rights has been committed and the country has not held the perpetrators responsible, then aid to that unit must not go. It must not be received. U.S. cannot send it legally. And so the administration needs to follow that rule here for these Israeli units, just like we do for other countries that we have found have engaged in gross human rights violations and perpetrators haven't been held accountable.
Before you go, Congresswoman, I wanted to get your take on how all of this also is playing out here in the United States, specifically with these growing pro-Palestinian protest movements that we're seeing across college campuses. It's safe to say that while most of the criticism has been coming from the right, there have been some members of your party who have attacked them, including people like Congressman Jared Moskowitz, who equated these protests with Charlottesville's Unite the Right rally, the white supremacist rally with the tiki torches. I just wanted to give you a chance to comment on how you see what is playing out right now across college campuses and the kind of, wide generalizations in describing these groups and students and professors as either terror sympathizers or Iran proxies or Hezbollah or Hamas sympathizers.
Look, I think when we have any social movement, any kind of protest, it's going to attract a lot of different people. I think the goal here is that Americans have a right to be heard, but students on campuses have a right to be free from discrimination, as well as the right to be able to get to and from their classes. I was a college professor before I ran for Congress, and these issues around free speech on campuses balanced against making sure every student can get an education and be free from discrimination are tough issues. But I think the thing that is good for our country that we shouldn't lose sight of, despite how unsettling and difficult these protests are, is that it is important that young people are paying attention to what's happening in the world. And so at the very sort of most fundamental level, I don't think we ought to be discouraging them from engaging, from having an opinion, but we do need to educate them on what are the limits of how they can express that opinion.
All right, Congresswoman Katie Porter, thank you so much for your time. We're going to continue to follow this story and hopefully have you back once you get some answers as well from the State Department on where things stand.
Thank you.